didn't like London.
London has been seen as a focal point for lots of foreign spies. Spies are drawn to cities where there is power and there is influence.
Most major cities are spy hubs. London certainly has that reputation, has had for many years, because of the intersection between US interests, European interests, and of course, Russian interests as well.
В Англии было много агентов. Информация шла потоком. Ее не успевали обрабатывать.
Foreign conflicts sometimes come into London because of its international nature, because you have dissidents here, you have other countries trying to target defectors and people here. And so you do have this enormous array of killings.
Espionage is an invisible art, and usually we don't want to be noticed. We blend in and work in the shadows. Our job is to steal secrets and not get caught. To a large extent, assassinations really have no place in the work of spies. You're trying to get secrets from people. You want them to be alive.
You definitely see other countries, though, using assassination and targeted killings as a tool, almost an everyday tool.
The Russian and Soviet state has a murky tradition of killing people that it regards as enemies. That could be Ukrainian fascists, it could be traitors within Moscow's own spy services, it could be enemies like Trotsky, felled with an ice pick in the head by an agent sent by Stalin, and others are more kind of question mark, you might say.
If you're a traitor in their eyes, there is only one penalty, and that's death. It appears death by as obvious and painful a method as possible.
It really is like the Cold War. Police in full chemical suits on the streets of Salisbury and a Russian double agent who worked for MI6 feared poisoned and critically ill.
Sergei Skripal was a former officer in the GRU, which is the Russians' first directorate, their oldest intelligence organization, military intelligence organization.
They are the tough guys. They are the intelligence soldiers within the Russian military. They're people who are trained to go abroad, to collect secrets, but also potentially to carry out covert military operations overseas. So Sergei Skripal joins the GRU. He's an undercover intelligence officer. He's posted abroad in embassies, in some cases, trying to collect intelligence effectively. And it's while he's in Spain at the embassy there that he's approached by someone who initially looks like a businessman, asking if he wants to do deals, do some consultancy, but eventually that turns into a relationship with MI6 as he's recruited as an agent by British intelligence to act as a spy in the mid-1990s.
He was, to the Russians, a traitor to the Russian nation. And Vladimir Putin has stood up and said publicly that a traitor should be killed.
It looks like Sergei Skripal could have betrayed the identities of hundreds of undercover Russian intelligence officers, GRU officers, serving in Europe and around the world to MI6.
I'm not interested in Skripal at all. I never was interested in it. We had, well, I had enough traitors in my own agency. Of course, he knew a lot about the officers of our military intelligence, and I'm sure he spoiled their careers.
Then finally, in the noughties, his luck ran out. By this point, Vladimir Putin was in power as president, and there was a kind of chill in the air. Skripal was demonstratively arrested. He wasn't just arrested, he was arrested with TV cameras, dragged out. So Skripal is in prison, 13-year prison sentence, no prospect of release. And then something incredible happens.
In July 2010, Skripal was added to the list of exchangees in the spy swap that was conducted in Vienna, where 10 Russian illegals who had been arrested in the United States were released in return for 4 Russians.
And so you get an old-fashioned, almost Cold War-like spy swap at Vienna Airport, in which Russians arrested in America are swapped for Russians who'd been spying for the West, serving time in Russian prison. And one of those is Sergei Skripal.
He was brought back into the UK and then settled into Salisbury after he got debriefed.
He was mostly working in consultant capacity, delivering lecturing, etc., etc., etc. Or formally it could be considered as work. But he was delivering no damage to Russia. To the Russians, it does not matter. It does not matter.
Вы умеете прощать?
Да. Но не все.
А что невозможно простить?
Предательство.
As the search continues tonight, so the questions mount. Were these 2 people deliberately poisoned? If so, by who and why? And has the past of a man disowned by his state led to him becoming critically ill?
The plan was simply, GIU was told to do it, and they came up with the plan. Then they sent the plan for authorization. It was authorized, and they went ahead.
So the GIU is quite a big, sprawling outfit, and within it, located outside the GIU's main building in a facility in northwest Moscow, is a sort of diversionary group of war veterans, combat veterans, who perform special tasks, such as sabotage, such as murder, such as assassination on behalf of the state.
I can't exclude even the situation when the people whose career he spoiled decided to make revenge on him and went independently there to London, you see, to kill him. You see, it's a crazy situation now.
Two intelligence officers working for the GIU, Petrov and Bashirov, that's the cover names, had flown in to London on a direct flight, book into an inconspicuous hotel in the East End, and on Saturday, travel by train to Salisbury on what clearly we now know is a reconnaissance exercise.
Petrov and Bashirov go to Salisbury, and they are seen and captured on CCTV, it turns out, wandering around the streets and going towards the vicinity of Sergei Skripal's house.
And that their real names were Shapiga and Mishkin. And we know that they were basically soldiers, and they were part of a super secret diversionary group based in France near the Swiss border, who had been behind all sorts of murders or attempted murders, assassinations.
Walking apparently without concern, it's believed this fleeting CCTV video shows Sergei Skripal and daughter Yulia heading towards a park in Salisbury, the poison possibly already coursing through their bodies.
The Russians, the Soviets, always want fearsome control over politics and political expression inside their own country. The threat to that is the exile. The threat to that are people who are operating outside their space. The answer to that problem is assassination.
Hours, Greenwich Mean Time.
BBC World Service presents Radio Newsreel.
BBC World Service broadcasting worldwide.
Dobry wieczór Państwu. Rozpoczynamy 6. audycję radia BBC z Londynu.
Georgy Markov, he's often described, I think, as a dissident. He was an incredibly brilliant writer, and because of his talent, he shot to the top of Bulgarian literary life. It was in the early 70s that he arrived in the UK.
Markov is working for BBC's overseas service, broadcasting anti-communist propaganda into Eastern Europe.
I feel in myself a necessity to rebel against any kind of authorities.
The theme that he spoke on in these broadcasts was the corruption and the lack of credibility and the closed-mindedness of the regime, and the lies that they told, not just to the people, but sort of about themselves.
We know that the Bulgarian intelligence services wanted Markov dead. They wanted him dead for a long time. He was a prominent critic of the regime.
I always had a feeling that he is looking over his shoulder. He told me that he gets threatening phone calls, and I saw the copy of a court decision that he is sentenced to death for being an enemy to the state.
So on the 7th of September 1978, it's another working day for Markov in the BBC World Service. He does what he always does. He drives his car a certain way to London, then he catches a bus from Waterloo Bridge.
Markov did what he did more or less every day. He parked his car and then he went up the steps, and at the top of the steps on Waterloo Bridge there's a bus stop.
So waiting there for the bus in the queue, and behind him is what he thinks of as a normal British businessman, city type, someone in a raincoat with an umbrella. That person stumbles and the umbrella jabs him in the back of the leg. And he feels a little prick. It's like a bee sting.
And he turned around and there was a man who appeared to have dropped an umbrella, who apologised to him and moved on, and he didn't think anything more of it. But as the day went on, quite quickly, he started to feel extremely ill indeed.
I met him when he came back with a bulletin in his hand. He was going to their studio, grey in the face and walking not very I immediately assumed that he is drunk. And when passing, I noticed that his eyes, they were, how shall I put it, not here. He didn't look straight. I said something, are you going all right or something? And he waved me off, get lost. And that's it, and that was the last time I saw him.
He starts to have flu-like symptoms, a temperature, And then he realizes this is potentially an attack. He reports to hospital. And initially, the doctors are quite dismissive.
He was telling them that he'd been attacked, but the only evidence of that was this little sort of red pimple on the back of his leg.
They think, oh, it's just an infection. They're treating him for standard infections. But within 2 days, they realize the infection is overwhelming his body.
He basically suffered organ failure. And yes, by the 11th of September, he was dead.
When an autopsy is conducted, the doctors eventually find a tiny metal ball, smaller than you would find in the tip of a biro. When they look at it, they see there are 2 holes in it, tiny, tiny holes.
What they found was a pellet full of ricin, which had been unleashed somehow from this umbrella into his leg.
Ricin is a biological toxin, which is incredibly virulent, very toxic, and it's made from castor beans. That ricin would have killed him, you know, very, very quickly. It is incredibly toxic.
It's never been definitively proved who did it. The police have looked at this over the years to try and understand it. All the evidence seems to point to Bulgarian intelligence having been behind the operation, but with the support of the KGB, who provided some of that equipment to carry out the assassination.
General Secretary of the Bulgarian Party, Zhivkov, appealed to Mr. Brezhnev to help him to liquidate Markov. And the only thing which we could do is to provide them with this umbrella, which was specially made, invented.
No one had heard of a weaponized umbrella before this happened. The special department, which was in charge of creating these types of technologies for killing, had in fact developed some kind of umbrella gun that was certainly capable of firing a pellet of this sort.
Well, I mean, it is very James Bond-ish, you know, that the idea that the QC, the Q branch in the Soviet Union, is developing these weapons.
And this has since become the archetypal Cold War assassination. It's really hit the public imagination because it's got hitmen, it's got gadgetry, it's got poison. And it also caught the public imagination because not only was it a crazy, ingenious assassination method, it happened right in the centre of London.
This story of spies and counter-espionage turned from claim to counterclaim today. First, the leading...
Alexander Litvinenko, former Lieutenant Colonel of the Russian Federal Security Service, or FSB, fled to Britain.
Tonight, this former agent for the Russian Secret Service is in hospital. His life hangs in the balance.
I met my husband Sasha in 1993, just a few years after Soviet Union collapsed. And of course it was a mess, but it was a lot of hope for new Russia.
In 2006, I was the head of the anti-terrorist branch at Scotland Yard. I remember very well the first time I ever heard the name Alexander Litvinenko. I was sitting in my office on the 15th floor of what was then Scotland Yard. One of my colleagues came in and said that in hospital in North London was a man who said that he was a former KGB officer and that he had been poisoned by some of his former colleagues. in London.
Alexander Litvinenko is a fascinating character. Essentially, he was a sort of cop. He was a detective who specialized in going after organized crime groups in the 1990s, and he was a sort of decent, honest, hard-working officer.
Every time when he tried to investigate cases linked to organized crime, it all came back to very high-rank officers of FSB or people from Russian parliament, and it was always cut. It means he was not allowed to complete this investigation.
It's something which is beyond my understanding, you know. To care about Litvinenko, some lieutenant colonel, it's a very minor person, you know, to care about. I don't think that Mr. Putin even knew about such a little person as Mr. Litvinenko.
Alexander Litvinenko, he'd actually confronted Putin himself in the late 90s when Putin had become the head of the FSB, the Russian security service. Alexander Litvinenko had gone to him to say that he believed that there was corruption, assassination, dark dealings going on with the FSB.
I gave him my report, and he looked at the chart but refused to take it. He also asked for my home phone number. I asked him what it was for. He said, "I'll call you." A few days later, an FSB friend laughed at me, and he said, "Putin ordered us to bug your phone."
And pretty quickly after this, Litvinenko, he's in prison, he's released, he's rearrested, he's in prison again, and it's clear that Putin wants to get rid of Litvinenko forever.
I left Russia because I was in fear for my life and afraid for the safety of my family and my 6-year-old son. If I go back to Russia, I won't last long there. I won't live long. I was told that I had betrayed the system and that the Federal Security Service does not forgive traitors.
Putin views Litvinenko as a traitor for having gone to him and having turned against his colleagues in the FSB. So from that moment on, really, Putin and Litvinenko themselves are personal enemies. They come to have an intense dislike for each other.
And when it comes to matters of life and death, when it comes to sensitive international assassinations, operations abroad, only Putin can decide this.
It was Litvinenko's investigation into the murder of this woman that could have made him a target this time. His friend, the Russian journalist Anna Politkovskaya, was murdered in her apartment block in October. She, too, was a harsh critic of the Russian president.
Anna Politkovskaya, Sasha's friend, she was, Sasha believed, in a list of enemies of Russia's state.
My name is Alexander Litvinenko. I am former KGB and FSB officer. My speech is difficult for me. Can I use translator?
Somebody has asked you directly, who is guilty of Anna's death? Who has killed her?
Я даю прямой ответ. Аню убил господин Путин, президент Российской Федерации.
And I can directly answer you. It is Mr. Putin, the president of the Russian Federation, who's killed her.
When Anna was assassinated, he was really shocked. And all this discussion about these names and this list of assassinated, of like one by one, and everybody said it's not true. But when it happened, Sasha realized it's true. Sasha knew he on this list, but he believed he's a professional and good enough to recognize the danger.
And one version, this is not verified, but one version of what happened is that Putin meets with his spy chiefs at some point in 2006 and turns to them, "I never want to hear that man's name again, ever." And that's clear. The order is kill Litvinenko.
If there was any doubt Litvinenko was a target of the Kremlin, you need only watch this video of Russian special forces in training. Their target, Alexander Litvinenko.
Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun are both former Russian security service officers who appear to have left the employer of the Russian security services, and you're involved in this world of investigations, which Alexander Litvinenko is also involved in.
Lugovoy was the first person who needed to approach Sasha. He was not a friend, but he was a man from this circle. And when they started to discuss to do business together, again, it all looked natural.
But instead what they don't realize is that Lugovoy is still effectively working on behalf of the Russian security service, the FSB, who use him to target Litvinenko.
Dmitry Koftin is a very strange, weird character in this story. I mean, he essentially served in the Soviet military, came from a Soviet military family, which is where he got to know Andrei Lugovoy.
I remember Sasha was immediately unpleasant of Koftin. He even couldn't say exactly what is his name. He said he's like a mystery man.
It very quickly became apparent that Lugovoy and Koftin were two people that we needed to take a particular interest in.
Alexander Litvinenko, 1st of November 2006, it was a sort of regular day for him. I mean, he was living in Muswell Hill in North London with his wife Marina and their son Anatoly. There was a business meeting planned with Andrei Lugovoy. CCTV tracks him. You can see these images of him walking through central London, and he gets to the Millennium Hotel in Grosvenor Square just ahead of a 4 p.m. appointment. And actually, you look at the CCTV and it's rather poignant. You see him arriving in the lobby, making a call, telling Lugovoy he's there.
We see Lugovoy and Koftin captured on camera, including in the hotel itself, in the Millennium Hotel.
At about 3:30 p.m., there's video of Lugovoy going up the steps, turning left into the gents' toilets. One of his hands is kind of tucked in like this, and he's got this kind of grey, foul visage. A few minutes after that, Dmitry Koftin does the same thing, repeats the journey, goes into the gents' toilets, and it looks like they were hatching the plot.
There is an interesting thing, which is the sort of sense that Russia, that they are geniuses. They all play chess. They know things. They're wizards. And that most certainly applies to their attributes within the secret world. But they make mistakes, trust me. They do make mistakes.
When Sasha came to this meeting and he was asked, would you like to drink anything? And some alcohol was served, and Sasha said, you know, I don't drink alcohol. He said, okay, but you could drink a tea. Tea was already prepared.
There's a pot of tea, a white ceramic pot, already on the table. Lugovoy calls over the waiter, who brings a fresh cup, and suggests to Litvinenko that he has some tea.
And when he took a sip of this tea, he was immediately realized something wrong.
There was something wrong with the tea, something strange about the tea, and he leaves it.
He didn't finish this cup. He might be few sips, maybe what helps him to survive for some longer period.
But after that moment, a couple of sips, actually there's nothing that could be done to save Litvinenko.
That evening, Litvinenko starts to feel ill. He's vomiting, he's feeling sick. He calls his wife Marina for help.
He couldn't breathe properly, and he always asked to open the window for fresh air. But in the second day at home, he started bleeding. Sasha lost weight, he looked very weak. It was very difficult for him to walk from upstairs to downstairs.
And he knows, even though it takes a little while for others to kind of realize this, he knows that he's been poisoned, and he tells Marina, I think I've been poisoned.
Eventually, he is admitted to hospital and eventually moved to UCL, where the police come and visit him and hear his story.
We dispatched an officer to interview Alexander Litvinenko in hospital. It was most unusual because we had, in effect, what was a living murder victim, someone who was describing, and I think he pretty clear in his own mind that he might well not survive this illness, but he was able to give a description of what had happened to him.
For such action requires the highest level of authorization. Because anybody who worked in the KGB knows that the system remains the same. These operations have always been very centralized. It was an intelligence which Putin was brought up. Exactly, everything must be authorized.
The message was loud and clear from Russia. This is what can happen to you as well if you do what he's done.
The Russian state is ruthless in tracking down what it perceives to be its traitors, people who were part of the regime, who worked there and who left and joined the other side.
The message that it sends back to members of the Russian services, you know, if you betray, your end is going to be agonizing.
There have definitely been examples when the British government has talked a lot about assassination and to some extent done planning for assassination.
I once asked an MI6 chief directly, do you have a license to kill? And he said, no, we don't have a license to kill. And I then asked him, did MI6 ever have a license to kill? And there was a little pause before he gave a more equivocal answer. And I think what that tells you is that in the past, MI6 has been involved in assassination plots.
Not with Egypt, still less with the Arab world. It is with Colonel Nasser.
There is some talk about assassination in the Middle East in the 1950s, and this is particularly aimed at the leader of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser.
Instead of meeting us with friendship, Colonel Nasser conducted a vicious propaganda campaign against our country. He has shown that he's not a man who can be trusted to keep an agreement.
Nasser is dedicated to Arab nationalism and throwing British bases and British interests out of the Middle East right across the region. This is what makes Eden see red.
Eden took it very personally, and he wanted Nasser removed. He wanted him overthrown. He authorized a load of different covert operations to get rid of Nasser.
You have two different British foreign policies in '56. You have the one that you'll read about in the newspapers, and then you have the second foreign policy, which is in the shadows, which is all the planning of how do we assassinate Nasser, when do we do it, where do we do it?
Not only did Anthony Eden want Nasser dead, he was also very open about this.
Anthony Nutting, who is the Foreign Office Permanent Secretary, he is phoned by Eden on an open line, which is incredibly unusual.
Nutting, now off duty, at the Savoy. What's all this about neutralizing Nasser? What's all this? I don't want Nasser neutralized. I want him murdered.
I want him destroyed. Don't you understand?
I don't want him messing around. He has to go.
Eden charged MI6 with coming up with ideas to kill Nasser. George Kennedy Young, who was a deputy head of MI6, was certainly a man who was not shy of issues like coups and assassinations.
Eden basically gives him carte blanche, that you go ahead and do it, organize it, and you are reporting directly to me.
George Young was also quite open about these plans. He insisted that Eden had given him personal instruction to bump NASA off.
The Foreign Office are horrified by this. Later, this period also becomes known as the horrors. But George Young is gung-ho for it, and he starts to organize this.
MI6 has an entire department, and it's public knowledge that it's called the Q department. And they do make weird, wacky gadgets. That is true. And they are ingenious.
All intelligence services have something like a Q branch because there is technical intelligence. You do need these things. And these branches have indeed developed well-known assassination weapons.
Famously, Fleming's character Q, the gadget man, is actually an inspiration of two characters who worked for branch of military intelligence MI9.
In the 1950s, Frank Quinn is the MI6 technical officer. He's absolutely the equivalent of Q in James Bond, and not just designing assassination weapons, but also all the covert paraphernalia of spying.
X-ray document scanner. A pen. This is a Class 4 grenade. 3 clicks, arms the 4-second fuse. Another 3 disarms it.
How long did you say the fuse was?
Oh, grow up, 007.
People in London are playing around with how you assassinate an answer. Do you poison him? Do you shoot him?
Quinn developed the idea of an exploding Remington razor. This was packed with plastic explosive. NASA was known to use this particular razor, and he was known to take regular shavings. They developed a packet of cigarettes which had the capability of firing a poison dart.
And apparently this poison dart was tested on a poor sheep down at Porton Down, and let's just say it worked.
Now, one that Frank Quinn, we know, was definitely involved in was putting poison in NASA's favorite chocolates. He had a particular brand of chocolates he liked, and Quinn ordered various boxes of them.
Poisoning NASA using chocolates was very difficult to achieve because MI6's technicians in Q branch had to work out how you can take the bottom off of a chocolate, insert poison into it, and then replace the bottom of the chocolate without anyone knowing that it had been tampered with.
Q branch develops, effectively the way it's going to be delivered. This does make it to Cairo through a diplomatic pouch, but now it's sitting in your embassy in Cairo. You've got to get them to Nasser.
MI6 had a problem with their plans to assassinate NASA in that their officers were no longer in Egypt. They'd been kicked out by NASA.
The British didn't have access to Nasser. They couldn't get the poison dart to Nasser. They couldn't get the chocolates to Nasser.
As far as we know, this was the last time that a British serving Prime Minister attempted an assassination.
Britain is bungling an amateur. That's one of the reasons that NASA lived such a long life.
At one point, they were going to pay NASA's doctor the equivalent of £500,000 in today's money to kill NASA. And he took the money and ran.
A license to kill for MI6, it doesn't exist. Assassinations may have once been authorised by the British government, but in modern times, well, I mean, it's purely the preserve of spy fiction. By nature of what you're doing, you're breaking that other country's laws. So whipping out a so-called license to kill isn't going to save your bacon.
The concepts of license to kill emerged through the exploits of James Bond, the most famous of the fictional intelligence officers. He goes around the world shooting people, blowing things up, sleeping with people, doing whatever he wants.
What do you say to that? It's a waste of good scotch.
Tuesday afternoon in Salisbury last week. The scene could hardly be any more mundane, except this is Sergei Skripal, the former spy who would be specifically targeted with his daughter days later.
Everything is normal in Salisbury until it isn't normal. So essentially, Sergei Skripal is there, his daughter Yulia is flying over from Moscow.
I was at a birthday party, and while I was there I had an email from my news editor at the time saying that someone had let us know that the air ambulance had landed in Salisbury city centre.
We got Chepiga and Mishkin coming down to Salisbury to go and look at the very tall spire in Salisbury Cathedral because it is spectacular. Excuse my Russian accent.
We could see from the CCTV them arriving. The sort of most shocking pictures, I think, for people in Salisbury was seeing them arriving at the train station and walking around the city centre.
They are seen and captured on CCTV, it turns out, wandering around the streets and going towards the vicinity of Sergei Skripal's house.
They go to Skripal's house, middle of the day, no one around, and they apply Novichok, a lethal nerve agent, to his front door handle.
Sergei Skripal, he then comes into contact with that on the Sunday, and then he and his daughter Yulia fall seriously ill.
Yulia collapses and Sergei starts muttering and behaving strangely and passers-by begin to notice them and think, you know, maybe they're off on drugs or something.
When I arrived in the Maltings, it was late afternoon. The two people were found on a bench which was over there, which has now been removed. It would have been a couple of hours, I think, after that, that the fire crews turned up. And that was when it first became obvious that something more unusual was happening.
I came into work as usual on the Monday. I did some activity in theatres, but I'd heard rumours that something was going on.
I was in Abu Dhabi at the time giving a talk to people about chemical and biological terror and state terror attacks. I got out and I had hundreds of missed calls and WhatsApp messages and everything else.
We had two patients admitted with a working diagnosis of opioid poisoning. These patients required intensive care. When I got to meet and examine the patients, things didn't sit right with me that was actually what was going on. And by that stage also, we'd come to be aware of the identity and professional background of our patients. And so there were alarm bells ringing about whether this could have been some nefarious activity and a targeted incident. When I went into work on the Tuesday morning, I took handover from my registrar who'd been on overnight, who just recently received a phone call from the Chief Medical Officer at Porton Down, explaining that our patients had had severe poisoning with an anticholinesterase toxin, which is a very, very serious and life-threatening condition where patients can go into multi-organ failure.
The symptoms that are being presented in hospital in Salisbury are consistent with a nerve agent poisoning.
I think the first time that we heard that it definitely was a nerve agent would have been when it came from the House of Commons.
It is now clear that Mr. Skripal and his daughter were poisoned with a military-grade nerve agent of a type developed by Russia. This is part of a group of nerve agents known as Novichok. The government has concluded that it is highly likely that Russia was responsible for the act against Sergei and Yulia Skripal.
Novichok is a lethal nerve agent which was created in secret facilities in Sarov, in Russia in the 1970s and 1980s by an elite group of scientists working for the state.
Probably the most deadly man-made chemical ever produced. To try and put it in toxicity terms, say something like chlorine, you know, the first chemical weapon, is toxicity 1. The first nerve agent, sarin, developed by the Nazis before the Second World War, would be 5,000. Novichok would be about 60 or 70,000. There was enough Novichok there to kill everybody in Salisbury. You could have killed tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people.
To use a nerve agent on the streets of Britain was something that no one expected and no one had ever seen before.
Novichok is basically a calling card. Really, only Russia produces it. It's linked with the Russian state. It was used in Salisbury by a Russian state military intelligence outfit. All of the signs point back to Russia.
Предательство или государственная измена, или измена Родине в форме шпионажа на иностранную разведку во всех странах карается очень сурово. В советское время приговаривали, как правило, в зависимости от тяжести содеянного, к смертной казни. И, в общем, я знаю, что и я, в том числе, и большинство моих коллег, мы с одобрением всегда относились к такого рода наказаниям.
Novichok is produced only in Russia. That's all. It's just that Putin has left his visit card. It was Putin's visit card.
Вот куда-то яд, сами его
и проглотят в конце концов. Сами этим ядом и отравятся.
The mystery surrounding Alexander Litvinenko's death is more and more complex, but the grief of a family is easy to understand. His widow Marina has lost her husband, their 12-year-old son has lost his dad.
I believe till last moment he will recover. Before Sasha died, night before that, it was cardio arrest, and he'd been unconscious last day. He'd been all under support machines. And I believe his heart was so strong, and he would be able to stay longer, even with this support machine. But his heart stopped at the end.
The day that he died about 9 p.m. in the evening, but that afternoon, Aldermaston, the government scientific facility, came back with a result from an examination of his urine and his blood.
I was on the motorway on my way back to London when I received a phone call to say that the substance with which Litvinenko had been poisoned had been identified, and it was something called polonium-210.
Polonium-210 is a radiological isotope, very, very rare, that is used in the nuclear weapons industry. Very, very few people have it. Any chemical or biological radiological weapon would have to be authorized at the highest level.
Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin!
This is not something that, you know, any random person or criminal or someone else could get hold of, polonium. This has to come through a state.
And at this point, it became clear to the British government that this was not just a suspicious death or a killing. What they were dealing with was a major and unprecedented crisis.
Very quickly, the police are able to understand that Dmitry Kovtun and Andrei Lugovoy are key suspects in this. They can see from the fact they've met Litvinenko, from the times of when he was poisoned. Then they're able to put together the trail of polonium and match it even to the aircraft they travelled on to the UK, as well as other places they'd been to in London.
Wherever they went, there was a kind of ghostly trail of particles, of gamma particles, which were subsequently detected. And that means that this assassination can be reconstructed in minute detail, minute by minute, hour by hour.
We tracked their movements, we found where they'd stayed in London, we found which aircraft they'd used to fly in and out of the country on, we found the offices that they'd visited in London. There were over 40 sites of radioactive contamination across London. Here you've got the weapon that they've left all over the place, but which helped immensely in terms of putting together the jigsaw.
If the British security services and police hadn't worked out what it was, this death may have just gone down as a mystery.
If Sasha died before he was able to give this evidence, and people who committed this crime, they exactly wanted him to die before, again, it would be just unexplained death. And not any trace of polonium, no any links to Russia, no any links to these people who did this crime.
Он просто шпион, предатель Родины. Понимаете, есть такое понятие «предатель Родины».
Он просто подонок. Вот и все.
If you listen to the language Vladimir Putin uses in, for instance, press conferences and interviews when he's asked about people who betrayed Russia, it is remarkable. He talks about swine, traitors, and it's quite clear that he is signalling they deserve to die.
Putin's approach to assassination is fascinating. If we go back to the mid-20th century, quite often the objective was to kill someone in a way that was hidden or at least plausibly deniable. What we see with Putin is a shift to implausible deniability.
It was a message, first and foremost, to the British government and to MI6. It says that we've got no respect for you. We can pursue our traitors at a time of our choosing, and we can settle with them. We can snuff them out whenever we want. And you are weak, you are powerless, and we can humiliate you. The murders, the murky killings continue.
The idea that foreign assassins can come into London and kill someone is an embarrassing failure. It suggests that people, including defectors, are not safe in Britain. And that is something which worries and embarrasses the security services and the police when it does happen.
If you look around the world, you can see that there certainly are intelligence agencies that do use assassinations. But this is not something the UK does.
The law in most countries in the world, espionage is deemed illegal. Here we are, people like me going over there, breaking other countries' laws. That's the nature of the job. We're spies, that's what we do.
I'm not sure it comes from a higher sense of morality, but rather this, that if you can get to somebody to assassinate them, you can get to them to bug them, to recruit them, to undermine them. Assassination is something that any service could do, but doesn't necessarily have to do.
I am quite sure that I am in the list of these legitimate targets. Vladimir Putin would definitely not hesitate to give authorization. How that successful it should be, we never know. Whether they manage to do so or not, we never know.
The idea of compromise, it's sinking to a certain level. It's not about winning someone around, it's about coercion, which is nasty.
Vassal is essentially compromised by being invited to a KGB-organised orgy.
Sex between two consenting adults is surely a better way to extract intelligence than torture.